But if you weren't here, just a quick review of last week. We talked about the flood. And once again, we realized that when you start with the Bible, when you build your thinking on the Word of God, you have answers. We talked about the ark, how the ark definitely does not look like that. And if you see a picture like that somewhere around here, please take it down and burn it. The ark was huge, plenty of space to fit all of the about 16,000 needed kinds of land, dwelling, air-breathing animals onto the ark. We also talked about how the flood was meant not only to wipe out mankind, but also meant to destroy this world. And that happened with the fountains of the great deep bursting forth, cracking the crust of the earth, causing earthquakes, tsunamis, tidal waves, volcanic activity, breaking up the once supercontinent with continental sprint happening very quickly. We see the scars left on the earth from that event. And then after the flood, it was a perfect time for an ice age because you have, again, warm water and cold air. And during the ice age is when people and animals could spread out all over the earth. Then as the ice age recedes, the water levels rise. Then animals and humans get trapped in certain places like Australia. And then you have the Stone Age because of the rough weather after the flood. And of course, you'd expect to find flood legends all around the world, which is exactly what we do see. So when you start with the Bible, you can have answers for the faith that you have. We saw that last week. And another important thing you'd expect to find if there really was a worldwide global flood, you would expect to find billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. You know what we find? Yeah, you guys got it. Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And that's what we're going to talk about for the next 2 weeks. And tonight we're going to focus on the layers, the rock layers. And there's no question that there are rock layers that cover this earth. The question is, how'd they get there? And again, in order to figure out how they got there, you have to use historical science. And this is where, of course, you have to use your beliefs and assumptions to interpret what you see in the present. And as we've said many times before, both biblical scientists and secular scientists have the same evidence, but they interpret it differently based on their starting assumptions. And what we can do, though, is we can take observational science, look at the information in the present, look at the rock layers in the present, and see which interpretation is confirmed by operational science, by observational science. And that's what we're going to do tonight. Now, if you go to the textbooks, they'll tell you a quote like this. It's from this science book. It says, "The Colorado River has cut through over 2,000 meters of rock, exposing sedimentary layers that are like huge pages from the book of life. Scan the canyon wall from rim to floor, and you look back through hundreds of millions of years. Each layer contains fossils that represent some of the organisms from that period of Earth's history." Now, what you just heard described there is commonly called the geologic column. And the geologic column is the idea that you can take all the layers with the fossils in them that are scattered throughout the entire world and put them in a nice, neat order, and those layers represent all of history, and they'll show the evolution of organisms from a common ancestor from the beginning to all the organisms we see today. That is the geologic column. Now, of course, this idea originated with Hutton and Lyell, as we talked about, I think, on week number 3. And, of course, they used the principle of uniformitarianism. Instead of biblical history, they decided to use this assumption, reject the Bible. They decided to think that the present is the key to the past. And they believed that, well, because they believed in naturalism, that everything can and must be explained by the laws of nature. And so using naturalism and uniformitarianism, starting in the 1800s and up to the present, secular scientists today use those two assumptions to interpret the rock layers, and that's based on the religion of secular humanism. And that's how you end up with a geologic column, millions of years, evolution, and the Bible is wrong. And again, we shouldn't be surprised that they come to anti-biblical assumptions or conclusions because they start with those anti-biblical assumptions. What we're going to see tonight, though, is that those assumptions, uniformitarianism and naturalism, fall short. They don't make the grade, and I'll explain the tree a little bit later on. But the first thing we need to identify about this geologic column, these layers of rock, is I want to show you a couple quotes. Here's a quote from a secular scientist who says, "No single area contains a record of all geological time. We need only to discover and correlate enough of these scattered fragments to build up a composite of the record of geologic time." In other words, what he's saying is it's not a neat and pretty record. You have to take the different fragments and put them together. The actual record is really, really ugly. There are layers, but they're scattered throughout the earth. You have to put them together and interpret them. That's how you get the geologic column. Now, I'm going to show you some quotes from a guy named John Woodmorappy. That could be the best last name I've ever heard of, Woodmorappy. But he's a creation scientist who has researched this in great detail. And here are some summary thoughts he has about the theoretical geologic column. He tells us that 2/3 of the Earth's land surface has only 5 or fewer of the 10 geological periods in place. 80 to 85% of the Earth's land surface does not have even 3 of the geologic periods appearing in correct, and that would be evolutionary consecutive order. A significant portion of every geologic period's rocks does not lie the rocks on the next geologic period. And some percentage of every geologic period rests directly upon Precambrian basement rock. That'd be the bottom rock. Even the Grand Canyon, which is probably one of the best examples of layers of rock stacked on top of one another, are missing 150 million years of this supposed theoretical column. Again, it is not a pretty picture. I like this quote from John Woodmore-Rappy to summarize his thoughts. He says, since only a small percentage of the Earth's surface obeys even a significant portion of the geologic column, it becomes an overall exercise of gargantuan special pleading and imagination for the evolutionary uniformitarian paradigm to maintain there ever were geologic periods. And guys, I want you to understand, I'm not saying that there aren't layers and you can't correlate them. You can. What I'm saying is it's not a very neat and pretty picture, and I think there's a much better explanation for what we see. The biblical flood does a much better job of explaining the actual stuff we see in this world today. And the first thing we need to realize about the biblical flood is that during the flood, you're going to have what's called hydrodynamic sorting of sediment particles. And that's a fancy way of saying as the flood waters move across the earth, they're going to pick up dirt particles and they're going to deposit them in layers. And these particles are going to settle into layers for multiple reasons. One, because of their weight, their density, their circumference, all kinds of stuff. You can actually do the experiment yourself. Take a jar, put some different types of dirt in it, some clay, some silt, dirt, gravel, whatever. Shake it up, set the jar down, and it'll settle in the layers for you just in a couple minutes. Doesn't take very long. You ever seen one of these? Little thing you get from the gift shop, different colored sand, flip it upside down, settle into layers for you in just a matter of no time at all. And that's what the flood would do as it covered the earth. And the thing about these layers, a lot of things about these layers are absolutely huge. Many of these layers go across entire continents and sometimes even between continents. Just a few examples, because we don't have a ton of time to talk about all the stuff we have tonight. Limestone. There's a layer of limestone that can be traced from Arizona all the way to England, and in some places thousands of feet thick. There are chalk beds that originate in England and go all the way to Australia. Coal beds that start in the Midwest and go all the way to the former USSR. These layers are huge, covering entire continents, some in places thousands of feet thick. And there is no mechanism operating today that makes layers like this that were formed in the past. There had to be something much greater that happened in the past to form these layers, which would be the fossil, which would be the flood. And then you have, in these layers, you'll notice a very unique feature. Between the layers, we don't find any marks of erosion, and also no soil layers. Now, if these layers are actually different periods of time, and one rock layer is waiting around millions of years for another rock layer to form over it, don't you think it might rain once in a while in a million years? You should find marks of erosion. We do not. It's just one rock layer right on top of another. We also do not find any soil layers. And again, if that layer of rock is really a period of time and life existed for millions of years, then we should find evidence of soil, of life, and it's just not there. It's just one rock layer with another rock layer stacked right on top of it. And in these rock layers, we find all kind of unique features. We find fossil tracks like this. Whether it's big critters like a dinosaur, or whether small critters like this trilobite right here, you can see the tracks. We find these fossilized tracks. Now, what's unique about this is in order to get these tracks, you need a special set of circumstances. Because if this dinosaur went walking through the mud and left those tracks, what's going to happen to those tracks fairly quickly? They're going to rot away, right? If you go walking down the beach, you leave footprints, they're gone pretty quickly. In order to actually preserve these tracks and let them turn into rock, you'd have to have the dinosaur walking through soft sediment, through mud, and then that layer would have to be covered by another layer of dirt very quickly to protect the tracks and give them time to harden into fossilized tracks. So you need one layer being laid down very quickly, then another layer right on top of it. Same thing with fossil ripples. We find these all over the world. In order to get these ripples, you need some soft dirt, some mud, some water to go over that mud, form the ripples, and then another layer of dirt to come over those ripples to protect them so they can be preserved as fossil ripples. And we also find fossil raindrops. Same thing. Form the raindrops hit the ground. That layer has to be covered with another layer of dirt very quickly. Here's the point with all three of those. These surface features are easily destroyed. And in order to protect them, preserve them, and make them become fossils, turn into rock, you have to protect them quickly, which means they have to be buried very quickly. This implies the layers were laid down very fast. Another intriguing thing about these fossil tracks, as you look at them, it's kind of cool. You can watch the tracks go up through the fossil record. The tracks start lower, and they work their way up. It's almost like he's trying to run up away from something. And then you actually find the fossil further up in the layers. This implies you got critters who are basically running for their life. As the flood waters covering the earth, laying down these rock layers, they're trying to dig their way out. And eventually they're going to run out of steam, give up, and die and get buried and turn into fossils, which is kind of sad, but that's what happens. Also, in these layers, if they were periods of time, you would expect to find evidence of bioturbation. And bioturbation is just a fancy way of saying evidence for life. If you go outside right now and dig around in the dirt, you'll find worms. They'll be digging through the ground, leave tunnels, they're making homes, all kind of good stuff. Same thing in the ocean bottom. Plants have roots. You find evidence of life. And as parents, I'm sure you all know, life leaves evidence. I'm sure you see that in your kids' rooms all the time. All right? And so if these layers were laid down over millions of years, then we should see evidence of things digging around, looking for food, making homes. That should be everywhere. That's not what we see. These layers, it's just one pretty layer stacked on top of another pretty layer with no evidence of life in between. It looks like those layers were laid down very, very quickly, maybe like in a global flood, as we talked about last week. So we don't have any evidence for bioturbation. And then we also have tightly bent strata. Now this is literally, we're talking about rock layers thousands of feet thick that are bent in hairpin turns without breaking, sometimes without even cracking. And the only way you could get this, one example over here in the Grand Canyon, you have one particular area, there's the people for scale. It's about 4,000 feet of sediment, 4,000 feet of rocks. And here you see the rocks going this way, then they make a 90-degree turn. Now, if this rock layer right here was laid down millions of years ago, it should be turned, it should be hard. And these rock layers appear to be soft. So when this land bent, these layers should break or crack, and this could be soft and it could deform. But since all these layers are bent in the same direction without breaking, without cracking, it implies all the layers were laid down around the same time, and then they were bent together when they were still wet and pliable during the biblical flood and towards the end of the flood. And then you have polystrate fossils. Now these are really cool. Polystrate means poly, multiple, straight, or strata means rock layers. So these are fossils that go through multiple rock layers. And if you believe these rock layers are millions of years old, and this is a really big problem for you, because we find multiple trees all over the earth that go through multiple fossil records, multiple rock layers. And really think about how long is a tree going to stand upright, or a dead tree going to stand upright in your town when it dies? It's going to stand upright for 5 years, 10 years, maybe 100 years, 1,000, not 1,000,000, right? Well, this implies, as we see these trees and buried in fossil records, they go through multiple layers of rock. Implies those layers of rock were laid down very quickly. And in some places, we find these trees upside down going through multiple rock layers. And now you've really got a problem if you believe in millions of years, not if you believe in a global flood. These trees and other polystrate fossils are great evidence that those rock layers are not different periods of time, but they were laid down quickly altogether. I know it's a lot of stuff. I want to get through a lot of the information, but to summarize, I'll use this quote from Dr. Gary Parker. He says, slow sediment buildup could not possibly produce the widespread deposits that we see today, those big layers. Nor could it produce the features that we see, the soft sediment features and so forth. In this case, knowledge of the present tells us that something happened on a much larger scale in the past than what we see happening today. That's not appealing to faith or fancy, but that's appealing to fact. So in other words, the features we see in the fossil record today confirm the biblical history and deny the idea of millions of years based on uniformitarianism. Matter of fact, some geologists, a lot of them actually, are referring to a new form of catastrophism called neo-catastrophism. And in this theory, they say, yeah, okay, the rock layers were laid down by catastrophes, each one very quickly, over multiple catastrophes over many years, but we still need millions of years. So where are we going to put it? Well, we'll put the millions of years between the layers where there's no evidence of anything. So you can't prove or disprove it. You just have to believe it by faith. But that's kind of popular today. And so what I wanted to show you, and will continue to show you, is that when you use uniformitarianism and naturalism to try to explain the features of the rock record, they fall short. which reminds me of a time where I was playing paintball with the youth group. And we were playing this game where we were in a field, and on one side of the field, the youth were over here and the leaders were over here. And the game, there was a tree in the middle, and the object of the game was to have control of the tree when the game ended. There was a time limit, 10 minutes. And so you gain control of the tree by touching the tree without getting shot. That's how you did, right? And so we're playing this paintball match, and it's getting towards the end of the game. The youth have control of the tree. There's about a minute left. And so we're bunkered down under our cover, and we're trying to figure out how we're going to try to get control of the tree. I said, guys, I got an idea. Cover me. So they jump up, they start shooting. I'll run out from cover, and I feel like Rambo. I'm running, I'm shooting as I'm running. Right, here I go. And then I run out of bullets, I just throw the gun down. I'm just making a dead sprint for the tree. I'm just getting it. And in my head, I had this beautiful plan. I was going to run towards the tree. When I got within about 10 feet, I was going to jump and dive. And I was going to hit the ground and slide and touch the tree right before time ran out. It was going to be epic. The youth will talk about it for the rest of their lives. That's what's going on in my head, okay? And so I'm getting closer to the tree, and I'm hearing the bullets whiz by, and I'm feeling it's like a movie. It's all in slow motion in my mind. And then I make my dive, and it's a beautiful dive, and I'm feeling pretty good about it. So I'm in midair. I'm looking at the trees right there in front of me. I'm thinking, this is going to be awesome. And I hit the ground, and I literally stick like Velcro. I don't know, I ran into a root or something, but I did not move. And my hands were about this far away from the tree, and then I got shot about 20 times by the youth. All right? And then we lost, and the game was over. So, yeah, I fell short. And you know what? I think when scientists try to use uniformitarianism and naturalism to explain the world today, including the rock layers, they fall short. It's just what happens. Now, another interesting side note, this is almost extra. This is for free. I just wanted to show you this. When you really break it down, dating methods are based on the geologic column. See, it ultimately works like this. You start off with the assumption of uniformitarianism, based on a religion of naturalism. And with that, you build the geologic column, thinking that the layers are different periods of time, millions of years. Darwin comes along in the 1850s and the 1860s. You add evolution into that equation. And then the geologic column then becomes the standard to which you hold all dating methods. So if you date something and it lines up with the geologic column, you keep it. If not, you throw it away. That is also true for isotope dating. Here's a couple quotes I'll show you. This scientist says, the most reasonable age from among the many conflicting dates offered when talking about isotope dating can only be selected after careful consideration of the geologic column. The geologic column is the standard. Here's another one. When using potassium-argon dating, that's what KAR stands for, it is common to discard ages which are too high or too low when compared with the rest of the data, such as the geologic column. This scientist is really honest. He says radiometric dating would not have even been feasible if the geologic column had not been erected first. Let me show you how it works real quick. So you establish a geologic column based on uniformitarianism and naturalism, and it becomes a standard. And remember that the geologic column, for the dates for the column were established in the 1800s, way before isotope dating. Not even a good portion of the geologic column actually exists in the present. It's built with the assumptions of uniformitarianism and naturalism, and as we just saw a second ago, natural processes cannot explain the layers. We don't see them forming today like they did in the past. So just keep that in mind. But here's how it works. Let's say you take a rock from the Jurassic layer. You might recognize the name Jurassic from Jurassic Park, right? And so you find a rock in the Jurassic layer, and it's supposed to be 150 million years old. So you date it with isotope dating, and you get a date of 160 million years old. You're pretty excited about that. So you date it one more time just to be sure, and this time you get another date of 500 million years old. Guess which one you drop? The 500, right? Because 160 is more in line with the geologic column. So you use the geologic column to confirm isotope dating, then you go back and use isotope dating to confirm millions of years and the geologic column. A little bit of circular reasoning. Like I said, that was for free, just a little bit extra. But as we look at the rock layers, there's no doubt, if you look, there's incredible evidence for massive erosion all over this earth. Some type of huge water cataclysm definitely did this, which of course we talked about last week, which would be the flood. We see great evidence all over the earth. And the question is, does it take millions of years to form these things? I mean, did that take millions of years? What about that? Did that rock formation take millions of years? I don't think so. There's a pin. Just a pile of dirt in the backyard. All you need is lots of water. Same thing here. That doesn't take millions of years to form. You just need a lot of water, like in a global flood. Which, speaking of large amounts of water and massive rapid erosion, that leads us to the Grand Canyon. Well, the Grand Canyon is absolutely awesome, no doubt about it. Has anybody ever been to the Grand Canyon? All right, that's awesome. I have not. I definitely want to check it out. I know it's a huge hole in the ground, but here it's incredible to see. It's 4 to 18 miles wide, over a mile deep in some places, over 200 miles long, absolutely gigantic. No one argues that it exists. Of course it exists. The question is, how did it get there? Was it long periods of time and a little bit of water, or a lot of water and a little bit of time? And again, we can use observational science to look at the canyon today to see which interpretation is supported by the actual evidence. Now, of course, the textbooks tell us that the Colorado River is what made that canyon. It cut through the layers of rocks over millions of years. The problem with this particular idea is that it's pretty much geophysically impossible. If you look at the landscape, look where the river enters the canyon. It enters the canyon at an elevation of 2,800 feet. The canyon itself rises to about 8,000 feet. And then it flows downhill for about 300 miles and comes out the other end of the canyon at 1,800 foot elevation. But the canyon itself goes up 5,000 feet. Now, for the Colorado River to actually make that canyon, it would have to flow uphill. Rivers don't typically do that. But if you will take a closer look at the Grand Canyon, what's really intriguing, if you go upstream, there's very solid evidence there used to be huge lakes upstream of the Grand Canyon. And of course, those lakes could not have been if the Grand Canyon already existed, because the water would have leaked out through the canyon. Now, these lakes actually probably formed towards the end of the flood. When we talked about last week, at the end of the flood, the mountains rose up and the valleys sank down. As the mountains rose up, the continents rise up, the waters rush off, and any bowl-shaped depression on the continents will be left filled with water. This will create huge post-flood lakes. And of course, the dirt that had been laid down during the flood would still be pretty soft. And so after the flood, you have these big lakes that are supported by a natural dam. And then for some reason, whatever reason, maybe an earthquake, maybe it continued to rain and the lakes overflowed, the water breaks through the dam, washes out that canyon in a hurry. We know this is what happened with the Palouse Canyon over in Washington. Natural dam broke, formed the canyon in no time at all. Looks a lot like the Grand Canyon, doesn't it? Pretty close, just on a smaller scale. Not only that, but if you look at the Grand Canyon, if that river did make the actual canyon itself, we should find a delta somewhere. There's no delta. That's about 1,000 cubic miles or cubic tons of land missing. But if you look downstream, there's evidence of rapid deposition, of surge deposits that suggest all this material being carried very quickly, that canyon is washed out very, very quickly. A good example of how things can form very quickly is Mount St. Helens. Very good example. And what we're going to do, I'll show you guys a little clip that kind of summarizes a lot of good information about Mount St. Helens, and we'll come back and revisit a couple of different things. You can just check this out.
On May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens, located 95 miles south of Seattle, Washington, erupted. The eruption was triggered by an earthquake centered beneath the mountain that measured 5.1 on the Richter scale. The lateral blast swept out the north side of Mount St. Helens at 300 miles per hour. With temperatures as high as 660 degrees Fahrenheit and the power of 24 megatons of thermal energy, it snapped 100-year-old trees like toothpicks and stripped them of their bark. Before the famous eruption at Mount St. Helens, scientists were mostly familiar with slow-acting examples of geologic change. But at Mount St. Helens, geologists watched the Earth's surface change quite rapidly. Icebergs were buried in hot avalanche material. They melted and formed badlands in days. Eruptions on May 18 and June 10 produced fine layers in hours. On June 10, mud flows cut zigzag canyons 100 feet deep in soft sand and mud, complete with perpendicular side canyons. Canyons that are reminiscent of the geography of Grand Canyon. only 40 times smaller and clearly produced within hours. Mud flows over the following decade cut hundreds of feet into solid rock in just days of cutting time. Fallen trees formed a log mat on the surface of Spirit Lake and dropped bark to the bottom of the lake, accumulating up to 3 feet of bark peat in just a couple years. And vertically floating logs sinking to the bottom of the lake resulted in buried trees in only a decade, similar to the trees of Yellowstone's fossil forest, which are also buried in volcanic layers. Even though Mount St. Helens is a very small catastrophe compared to the flood or the major catastrophes immediately following the flood, it provides a better clue to what happened in those times than the slow geologic processes which are most commonly seen in the present.
It's pretty awesome, right? Yeah, it's a great demonstration of what catastrophic processes can do really, really quickly. And really, Mount St. Helens, the eruption itself, was a small, tiny, minute, insignificant, you guys get the idea, a very small eruption compared to volcanic activity that happened in the past, and we know that for sure. But we saw that it formed rock layers really quickly, just in a matter of hours or even days. And then these layers even get small laminated layers in just hours. Absolutely amazing. Of course, the canyons they just described. This canyon, they call it the mini Grand Canyon because it's 1/40th the size of the Grand Canyon, created in just hours. About 1,000 feet wide in some places, over 140 feet deep. And you know, just like that river didn't make that canyon, that little river didn't make that canyon either. And then some people ask, well, what about stalactites and stalagmites? Aren't they formed over thousands or millions of years? Who's ever gone to a cave and had the tour guide give you the same spiel about don't touch anything, these things took millions of years to form? Yeah, and most of us have heard that. You see that Carlsbad caverns over in New Mexico over 250 million years ago. And it used to be thought that it took about 100,000 years to get 1 cubic inch of flowstone formation, which essentially all this is water carrying minerals. The water evaporates and the minerals accumulate, forming stalactites up top, the things that hang down, or stalagmites, those are the things on the bottom. Well, we know it doesn't take that long to form these things. Here are some stalactites underneath the Lincoln Memorial, which was built in 1922. In just 40 years, we got 5-foot-long stalactites and a little stalagmite right there just for good measure. Over at a memorial in Indiana, there's stalactites all underneath the memorial in just 40 years. There's even a column where stalactites and stalagmites connected in just 40 years. Here's a cave in Australia, got closed down. They reopened it in 50 years. When they opened it back up, got a huge surprise. Look at the stalactites and stalagmites that have formed in just 50 years. Notice the people there for scale. Absolutely huge. Here's a cave in Australia that was artificially cut out 140 years ago. And they got this stalagmite in just less than 140 years. Doesn't take that long to have these formations. A water wheel that literally the water kept overflowing, carrying minerals as it overflowed, the water evaporated, turned the whole thing to stone. 60 years. Or check this out, this is pretty cool. This is a bat that got covered by a flowstone formation before it could even decay or be eaten by another animal, which means it had to be covered fairly quickly, which means this flowstone formation formed really quickly. And you can even go to Wyoming. That's just the tip of the iceberg. You go to Wyoming and find a place where they plugged into a hot mineral spring underground with a pipe, brought the water up, and as the water kept coming up, it kept depositing minerals. And over about 100 years, it made some really big mineral formations. You know, in your sinks, how water leaves behind minerals like that in different colors. Hopefully your sinks don't look that ugly. That's not from my house, by the way. I think my wife might get mad if I didn't say that. That's true, it's not from our house. But no, if you go to Wyoming, check this out. I think it doesn't take that long to form mineral deposits. Look at that. That's in about 100 years. That's a lot of lime. That's going to take some lime away. All right? That's all I'm saying. Here's another one just down the road, again about 100 years old. This one started a few years later, not quite as big, but still really big. It does not take millions or thousands of years to form these things. You just need the right conditions. Like in a global flood where you have a whole bunch of underground water covering the earth with a whole bunch of minerals form caves and stalactites and stalagmites really fast. I like these quotes from this book to summarize this particular issue. Caving into reality, the shrinking age of stalactites and stalagmites. And from this book it says, what geologists used to believe was fact in terms of dating a cave, now is speculation, Trout says. He's the geologist who they were quoting from this book. From 1924 to 1988, there was a visitor sign above the entrance to Carlsbad Caverns that said, Carlsbad was at least 260 million years old. In 1988, the sign was changed to read 7 to 10 million years old. Then, for a little while, the sign read 200 or 2 million years old, and now the sign is gone. They got tired of changing the sign. It goes on to continue in the book. They said they did some photo monitoring of stalactites and stalagmites, and they saw them grow inches in just days. And on top of that, we already talked about how oil can be made very quickly. Just take some organisms, bury them real quick during a flood, they'll make oil. Coal, you can get in literally hours. That'll be the plant vegetation that's buried during the flood by the rock layers, heat and pressure with all the vegetation from the pre-flood luscious vegetation world. That's going to be buried, forming huge coal layers, as we see today. Rocks do not take millions of years to form. They don't. Here's a ship's bell that's fossilized in rock. That ship's bell is not millions of years old. Here's a piece of a clock, also fossilized in rock. It's not millions of years old. And I don't think this spark plug is millions of years old. I'm checking into that. I'm not sure. But really, if you think about it, cement is artificial rock. All the company does is they separate the rock for you from the minerals. You bring it home, add the water, starts a chemical reaction, makes rocks for you right there. That's all that happens. So something similar could happen like that during the flood. And then to kind of wrap up tonight, I thought it'd be interesting to show this to you. Do you realize that there are canyons on Mars that are larger than the Grand Canyon? That's true. We've seen them. They're amazing. They're really, really big. And according to secular scientists, those canyons were formed in just a few weeks. How? That's a good question. Well, here's what they said. Quoting them, a flood of biblical proportions on Mars formed these canyons. It carved an instant Grand Canyon. Actually, the canyon is a lot bigger than the Grand Canyon. Do you realize they believe in a flood of biblical proportions on Mars where we can't find a drop of liquid water? But they won't believe in a biblical flood on Earth that's covered by 70% water. Why is that? I just like the picture. I think the answer is in 2 Peter 3:3-7. As we said, the scoffers are willingly ignorant of the creation, the flood, and the coming judgment. You see, a flood on Mars has no relation to the Bible. It doesn't say anything about God. It doesn't matter. If there's a flood on Mars, no big deal. But a flood on Earth, that confirms a biblical account, which means the Bible is true. There is a God. We're accountable to Him. That's why it's rejected. And as we see, if you look at the actual evidence, it confirms the biblical account and rejects the idea of millions of years and uniformitarianism. When we build our thinking on the Bible, we have answers for the hope that we have. And again, I know it went kind of fast, but there's a lot of stuff in there, and it's a lot of terms. It's hard to get through that, all that just plain information. But I wanted to give you a taste of what's out there. If you want more, if that's your thing, geology is your thing, 2 great books on the topic. Again, I shared them last week. Earth's Catastrophic Past by Andrew Snelling. Really, really good. You can also find some great articles on answersingenesis.org. If you want to talk about some other things, come on up. Be glad to chat for as long as you like. And we'll close out a little bit early tonight. All right? Let's close in a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, God, we thank you for this night. Thank you for this time. And God, we thank you for just the evidence that confirms your word. Lord, I pray that you would give us a heart for you and a heart for lost people. Help us, Lord, to glorify your name and use us to draw people to yourself. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.